Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast. Protect your people, managing and engaging talent through cross-border M&A deals, sponsored by Go Global. If you're watching this webcast via live stream on any of our social channels, you need to view the archive recording on HR.com to receive credits. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Go Global for their presentation.
Great. Thank you, Hester, and HR.com. And thank you all for joining us here today. I'm Andrew Lindquist. I'm a partner with Go Global. We're a global employer of record service provider. We'll dive into what that actually means a little bit later. I have spent the first half of my career working internationally. So 9 years in Asia, a few years in Europe, managed teams from Paris to Beijing. I like to say that I've made a number of the mistakes that I try to help our clients avoid in what we do on a day-to-day basis. I spent the second half of my career essentially helping clients expand and operate internationally. I've been involved as an employee, as a manager, as a consultant on a number of M&A deals, including here at Go Global. I have invited Chuck Morit to join us. Chuck, I'll let you introduce yourself, but before you do, Chuck is on our advisory board, has a great deal of experience in this space, and it's my pleasure to introduce Chuck to introduce himself.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Pleasure to be participating in this webinar with HR.com. My name is Chuck Morit. I'm a partner with Mercer in our merger and acquisition practice. I've been a very long time M&A consultant in the Mercer world. For those of you that are not familiar with Mercer, we're a global human resource consulting firm that consult to organizations around health, wealth, and career of their workforce. And then I work within our specialty merger and acquisition practice. Been part of Mercer for decades now, and I spend pretty much all day, every day, doing M&A transactions. And as Andrew had said, I'm a senior advisor for Go Global on their advisory board. It's really a pleasure for me to be affiliated with Go Global and the organization.
So real quick, we're a global employer of record provider. We help hire talent across the globe on behalf of our clients. We've operated in 110 countries around the world. We have more than 50 nationalities on our staff. 60 offices, are actually at 62. We keep adding offices. So even since we put this presentation together, we've actually added a couple of countries. We have over 220 internal staff. There's some basic stats up here that sort of give you a snapshot of the type of workers that we work with, the length of contracts, and the size and scope of what we do. So maybe, I think what we want to do here today is dive into some key details around talent engagement and HR considerations throughout the M&A process. We'll cover some topics like acqui-hiring, carve-out deals, orphan employees, the importance of culture in a deal, how to overcome some of the headwinds and lack of alignment across teams on a cross-border deal, and how an employer of record provider can be involved in a M&A deal, what our role is, and how it can actually help facilitate a deal. I think it would be really helpful just to start off. And by the way, Chuck is a jazz musician, and I'm a little bit off the cuff. We're going to try to keep this interactive, a little bit more conversational, like hopefully have a good jam session with the folks here. But we'll cover a good deal of content. We do have a presentation be shared with the group, as well as our M&A guide that Chuck and I co-wrote together as well. So there'll be some meaty content. We'll look at the chat if there's questions. If relevant, we'll try to answer them real time. There'll be some poll questions, so encourage everybody to participate in that. But what I thought I would just start off with is just kind of a snapshot, Chuck, of the market from an M&A perspective, the activity level, the types of deals that are currently active, and kind of what we can expect maybe for the rest of the year, knowing that things changed awfully quickly. Given what happened about a week ago in the finance industry, obviously, probably more deals happening in that sector than we would have anticipated just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so when we think about deal activity right now, there's been a lot of, I think that the first thing to think about in the deal activity, to Andrew's point, it ebbs and flows into different sectors, into different sizes, whether you're a financial buyer from a PE firm or you're a strategic buyer, corporates. And so some of the dynamics that are driving deals right now are, of course, the interest rate environment, so availability of cash. Currently, the financial market seizing up or meltdown, whatever word you want to use to characterize what's going on right now and some of the concerns. And so some of these catalyst events. So what we're seeing in the market right now are a couple of things. One of them is deal activity is actually still very high. So some of the press may say deal activity is starting to soften, but we're not seeing that. I think what we're really starting to see is the mega deals currently have cooled off a little bit, but mid-level deals, small deals are really in full force, because what's happening right now is organizations are saying, okay, how do we rebalance our portfolios? So in going through that portfolio review, segments of companies are now being available. And then therefore, we're seeing a lot of divestiture and carve out activity, which bodes well for Go Global and the EOR solution. We'll talk about that because that's a key trigger and solution for us in order to support carve outs and stand ups. But we're seeing a lot of mid-level deals, seeing a lot of divestitures across industries, also seeing private equity slow down a bit, perhaps at the private equity level, just because of the availability of capital. But what's interesting, if you look at a private equity portfolio company, they're actually making acquisitions. So the portfolio company, the private equity firm may not be doing that, but the portfolio company is. So we're seeing a lot of deals of bolt-on acquisitions, small acquisitions to support the deal thesis that's happening. As far as industries go, we're seeing pharma deals constantly. Haven't seen any of that slow down a bit. I think Pfizer announced a deal within the last week, multi-billion-dollar deal, and there were a few other deals announced in the press. Clearly, there's some financial sector deals going on right now, both with some of the prime candidates like SVB and First Republic that will now be involved in transactions. But we're going to see this be a catalyst for other organizations conduct transactions. And we're seeing a lot in the manufacturing space right now. So there's no shortage of transactions across the sectors.
No, that's really interesting, Chuck. I think, from our perspective, and you probably, this is what you do on a day in and day out basis, but we're seeing sort of similar things. Obviously, we're talking to other players in the market, getting a sense that there's quite a bit of dry capital in terms of the private equity funds, but in terms of fundraising, because a lot of them are leveraged, maybe a wait until interest rates steady or people just get accustomed to the current rates. So we sort of anticipate there'll be more of that towards the back end of the year. We're working on several carve-out transactions, so that aligns, Chuck, with exactly what you're saying in terms of opportunities in the market, companies looking to divest non-core assets. And that's really a role that an employer of record can play, and we'll speak a little to that.
Yeah, let me jump in a little bit on when people think. I think the term carve-out's an interesting term.
Yeah.
And many people on the line may have heard it, but what does a carve-out really mean, and why is that characteristically both an interesting and challenging type of transaction? So when these carve-outs are happening, typically conglomerate organizations are going to take a piece of their business that has the front end operations. So for example, take somebody like Tropicana, who carved out of PepsiCo about a year ago. So you have a well-established brand that's a standalone brand in a conglomerate organization. And so as you think about business structure, the front, middle, and back of businesses, that Tropicana brand, that was the front end of the business in the broader Pepsi ecosystem.
Right.
So when it got carved out, what the buyer was able to acquire in that case was the front end part of the business, so the manufacturing, the brand, the sales, but all of the middle office and back office infrastructure was so entangled in parent Pepsi as a corporate entity that that did not come with part of the transaction. So the unique characteristic when people are buying these carve-outs, companies are doing the carve-outs and people are buying them, is they're not getting a fully operational business.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, then they have to build that business, hire employees, and I determine how, when, and where they're going to be deployed around the world to build eventually that standalone business. So that's something we'll get into a little bit more of how this solution really plays into that characteristic and capability.
Yeah, and before we dive into that, I think that's exactly one of the areas where employer of record plays a role, because with those types of deals, you're not necessarily buying the legal entities that house the workers. So there's a couple of a few different options that the buying company would be, if they have existing entity in that country, would be to absorb the workers into that legal entity. The second one would be to set up their own legal entity to employ the workers. And the third option, might be, particularly for small headcounts or even as a bridge solution to some of the larger countries where it may take longer to set up, would be to use an employer of record. And so maybe it would be helpful just to dive into what an employer of record is. So let me just pull up that slide now that I can click. So what is an employer of record? It's essentially the legal vehicle to hire a worker. So oftentimes it's when a company or an organization doesn't have the legal entity in that country. The employer of record, otherwise referred to as EOR for short, provides the legal vehicle to hire and the HR support to facilitate the hiring and the day-to-day sort of HR and compliance that's necessary to maintain the employment. The worker basically takes direction and control directly from the client, with everything, with the exception of sort of disciplinary action and termination of the worker, because the legal employer, the employer of record, needs to act in those circumstances. So it's a way to get set up really quickly. It's also a lot more economical than setting up a legal entity to employ maybe a handful of employees, especially with the types of deals in larger carve-outs where you may have a significant headcount presence in one or two countries, and then maybe some sort of middle size populations in other countries. And then sort of onesie, twosies, maybe 3-4 people in a number of countries that supported that product that was, or service or element of the company that is being carved out. Chuck, any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, where I was going to go is, in order to get to the continued discussion of EOR, might be good to go to our first polling question, because we may want to do a little bit of myth busting in the context of EOR versus other types of solutions that people might confuse EOR with.
So true or false, are an employer of record and a professional employment, EOR, and a professional employment organization, PEO, the same thing? True or false? And I'm going to give you all a few minutes to answer that. It is a question that comes up quite a bit in our space, and I think PEO is a very well-known way to employ people here in the US. I think some of the use cases are exactly the same, but there are some fundamental differences between the two. So I'm going to give it away The answer to the question is false. So
awesome. We get some well informed people attending the call today.
yes. So I think the biggest difference is in order to have a PEO arrangement, and that's very typical in the U.S. You have to have a legal entity in country, and a lot of the sort of use cases are very similar. It's a means to have outsourced HR support. It's a means to offer different sorts of benefits to workers. In the case of the PEO, usually you're talking about hundreds of thousands or at least tens of thousands of workers in that country. So you're talking about pooling of supplemental benefits that reduces cost. Now, some of that exists at EOR, but not at that scale generally. There's typically no co-employment relationship in an EOR. Now, there are some instances in places like Europe and other places where you have labor leasing, which is not exactly EOR, but it's sort of a subsection of EOR, where you have an entity in country and you're getting labor from a third party like a Go Global. And usually there's restrictions around how that works, length of employment, et cetera. So different from PEO, even in those circumstances. But it's a good myth buster. If you have any questions around what the differences are, I'll look at it in the chat, or happy to talk about more about it offline. So we'll just dive into question number 2. And this is just for us to get an idea of sort of the audience and level of experience. I'm sure there are folks on this call that have probably been through multiple acquisitions and mergers or even divestitures in the last year. And then there are probably some folks that have never been through that in their lifetime. And a lot of the concepts that we're going to be introducing will be new. So just curious to see where you guys all sit. And it'll help drive the conversation a little bit as well. So give you a few seconds on this. As an employee and as a manager, I've experienced both buy side and sell side acquisitions and mergers, and I've been through some nightmarish scenarios. All of which were international. And if I would have known now, and also in at least one of those circumstances, had I known that, EOR or employer of record was an option, I think it would have changed the nature of that transaction. So we're split about 50-50. So it means there's a good portion of the audience that has been actively engaged in some form of M&A in this past 12 months, which is great. So a relatively informed audience, I would say, Chuck. But there's probably some folks, like I mentioned, that may be hearing some of these terms for the first time.
Yeah, merger and acquisitions are like bicycle riders, and that there's 2 types of bicycle riders: those that have gone down and those that will. There are people in the M&A world, they either have done deals or there's going to be a deal in their future. So I'm assuming that the people that voted no, haven't done one in 12 months, either have one on their horizon and are interested in some of the topics here, or it's been a while. So we're glad you've joined, and we'll get into a number of the areas that'll be interesting for you as you embark on your next transaction that address items like we're going to talk about here. The buy versus build mentality of acqui-hiring, and in fact, more broadly, why do people do deals?
Yeah, I was going to say, Chuck, like this is something. So I tell people I'm a recovering Californian. I was about 13 years in Silicon Valley, and this is obviously very prominent in the tech space. So maybe just at a high level, what's the concept behind acqui-hiring, and what specific sets of challenges does it bring to the table?
Yeah, well, when you think about why people do deals, there's generally 3 or 4 different key considerations that drive the deal thesis. And so that deal thesis is either going to be acquire new set of customers, acquire a new set of capabilities, and those capabilities could either be products, or technologies. It could actually be to expand into new geographies, or in some cases, it's a defensive play to take out a competitor. So one of the critical aspects in the deal world is really understand what that thesis is and what's the driving consideration for why the transaction's taking place. Underlying all of that is people. And in order to distinguish between the product or service, the customer relationship, the driving technology or capability in a certain geography, people make the critical difference there. And so this notion of acqui-hiring, what that allows companies to do is actually to do what I'm going to call an asset light acquisition and specifically acquire the skills capabilities of the people that align to that deal's thesis. So if I need critical technicians, engineers, R&D specialists, data scientists, whatever they happen to be based off that thesis, the acqui-hire allows me to basically go hire skills, capabilities, and people in mass without having to get bogged down, if you will, in an asset-heavy transaction associated with that. And so you see some of the points on the screen of what acqui-hiring facilitates is it can be fast, you can align culture more quickly, you're able to get intel and expertise with those people quickly. It's a lower cost type of transaction because it's asset light. And in fact, it allows you to maintain your reputation as an acquirer and integrate more effectively. Andrew, other thoughts on that?
No, I just wanted to introduce the theme, and I think one of the main points that you brought out was what is the thesis for the deal, and I think that's going to sort of hit home on some of the next points that we talk about. So we're going to talk a little bit about talent, culture, and due diligence. So, I guess. One of the things that I've seen on some of the deals that I've worked on and been a manager and been part of, both from the buy side and the sell side, is how things can go wrong really early on in terms of communication, and also just how cultural considerations, and I'm not talking necessarily about national sort of cultural considerations, but certainly that can play a role in a deal as well. Depending on where the different assets may have their main base of employees or where core parts of their business are, could have a big impact on the deal. But it's also been around the communication process and seeing a lot of that talent sort of exit as a result of that. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about some of the key considerations, and I touched upon a few of them. Chuck, do you want to touch upon any of these in any more detail? Do you want to walk through them? I think these are kind of core parts that are really important to managing the deal, and something that needs to be sort of planned before the deal even goes through, having sort of a playbook and an idea of what the course of play is going to look like. Do you want to speak to how you're working with clients to do just that?
Sure. And actually, to that point, I'm going to both take it from a outsider view as a consultant and an insider view for one of the items that I didn't let the people on the webinar know, that I also serve in some of those carve-out transactions as the interim CHRO. So I get to be in a unique position of being an outside consultant type, but as well as sit inside the company doing a transaction as an interim executive and really see directly the importance of many of the critical business, operational, people issues that are required to stabilize the transaction. And so where I'm going with this is in the communication protocol and strategy. The communication is really critical, because as organizations go through transactions, that catalyst event is very disruptive. People don't have a sense, or they get concerned, is my job intact? Is the strategy of the company going to be intact going forward? In carve-outs, you typically have new leadership come into place. In fact, in each of the carve-outs where I've served as interim CHRO, basically did that because there was no leadership coming over. And one of the first key activities I had was to work with the new ownership group in recruiting and establishing CEO level roles. So people are very concerned when they don't know who the leadership is. So that communication protocol and approach is important about the organization, about what the go forward path and strategy is. But then it eventually boils down to what's in it for me? How am I going to be affected? Am I going to have a job? How's my pay going to change? And building that narrative is really important for that communication, openness of communication, and stabilization. And so you see, that's the first item on this page. That directly influences the communication of the corporate culture, facilitating a smooth transition process, clarifying people what their go forward deal is going to be in terms of compensation and benefits. And then where unions in place, making sure there's stability with the unions and the union workforce. So I can't overemphasize having a very structured, focused, and dedicated communication approach and protocol across the company and down at the very local level.
Yeah, and you touched on some really key points and where we get involved in deals. A couple of things. Whenever it's international, and I would say a lot, I won't say most, but a lot of deals will have some sort of international component to them. All these things may be heightened because in Europe, for example, most countries, the workers will be, even if they're white collar, will be part of some collective bargaining agreement. They may be subject to work council rules where they may play a role in having a voice in how the acquisition unfolds, at least a voice in that process. Things like compensation and benefits are particularly hard when you're going from a larger organization to a smaller organization. And so as an employer of record service provider, we may be larger in some cases, but oftentimes we're smaller. Using sort of the beverage company example, we were involved in a transaction just like that. In that case, obviously they were, the workers were coming from a much larger organization. The key there is, right, and some of this is dictated by local rules and regulations, is it's almost always going to be impossible to match benefit for benefit. So you never look at it as a one-to-one sort of scenario. Our key is making sure that when the workers come over to an employer of record platform like Go Global, is that the workers are made better or the same as their previous employment as a whole. So we do a gap analysis. We look at where we may offer better compensation or benefits versus what they had previously, and then sort of identify ways to augment any of those gaps that would be negative. But that's a huge thing in terms of consideration. If it's just a US deal, you may not have some of those hurdles to overcome that you would in an international deal. Also, just thinking about timing is another probably key thing, right? So if you're having to stand up legal entities to employ people, that needs to be considered as well, or what an interim solution might look like. Because in a place like India, for example, it's probably going to take the better part of a year or at least 6 months to be up and operational. You may have a legal entity set up in a month or two, but to actually stand up payroll, run payroll, have bank account facilities, all of that, you're probably looking at, at least a 6-month window in a lot of countries. And so, planning that and how that impacts timeline of the deal, impacts communication, is also a key thing to consider.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, one other point I'd add in the communication view is that there's a couple different perspectives to take on communication. And I'm actually in the middle of working in a carve out and stand up and serving as interim CHRO there. We're in probably 24 countries right now. And the critical factor there to think about from a communication strategy point of view is have what I'll call the universal strategy. So make sure that that global universal strategy of why the deal, what's in it for people, what's the order of operations, what people can expect, give people that information so they understand what's coming. But then the critical part of making it local is then you actually have to translate this into a dozen or so languages. So even though we have a universal strategy right now in our communication, we then have to take that down to the local level, communicate it into a dozen languages so it really hits home at that local level and we can communicate to people on the ground so it means something for them, to promote that engagement, reinforce the culture, and how to facilitate the culture.
I'm going to come back to the culture in just a second. And well, why don't we dive into that right now? So, one of the things that I always think of as a really hard thing to sort of measure and get right is the culture, and how do you due diligence on that, Chuck? I mean, how do you help a company figure out whether what they're buying is a cultural fit? It's one of those things that seems more art than science, but is there some science behind it? Are there some things that companies can do to see that through?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, for that. And so actually, yeah, from our perspective, from Mercer's perspective, we think that, when to your point of your question, people think culture is this squishy, touchy, feely, can't manage kind of thing. And we're 180 degrees from that. In fact, we believe culture actually can be very well defined, very well articulated, and there's what I'll call the hard wiring of culture, then the soft wiring of culture. So what I mean by that is that hard wiring of culture, for those of you that can see the screen, you'll see 10 dimensions here in this pyramid that articulate the dimensions of culture. And it all starts from the articulation of vision, mission, and values. What does the company stand for? What is it looking to accomplish? And what does it value most? And then that other part of the hard wiring is how are we structured as an organization? What kind of leadership skills, capabilities do we want? All the way down to the employee compensation, benefits, work environment, and the employee value proposition. So with that hard wiring of culture and being able to articulate clear, definitive perspectives on each of these items, we can then start to set the basis of what's our culture and what's the acquired culture of the company need to look like, and start to do that compare and contrast. So that's the hard wiring part of it. Then how do you get to the soft side of it? Well, the soft side of it, once we have the hard wiring, how do we want people to operate within the context of that hard wiring? Meaning, what kind of communication protocols do we want to facilitate amongst leaders, amongst coworkers, amongst collaboration, and things of that nature? And so the next question becomes, and I'll kick it back over to you, Andrew, because I think it's a critical thing as we think about the employer of record model in the context of a broader corporate ecosystem, is how do you actually align the culture for employees that are part of the EOR model in the broader global ecosystem to ensure we're consistent with that desired culture and operating model?
Well, it's a really good question. So I think the first part is the employer of record is really there to help facilitate that alignment. And I think if I just sort of take it back a slide, communication being part of that process, it's really critical for workers that may be employed through the employer of record model to understand that, but also be presented almost as a benefit to them. And I say this whether it's an M&A deal or we're taking over from an existing provider, or a company is hiring for the very first time in a country and using EOR to do that, which is to say, use Go Global, use the employer of record model as a perk in a way, right? Because what you're getting is sort of that local expertise and HR support. In the case of Go Global, it's, in country. So we have local HR support in the countries that we operate in. It's also being able to speak the language, understand the cultural nuances of operating in that country. So from a buyer's perspective, utilize that to understand sort of the ecosystem for which you're sort of buying into, and these workers are going to be employed, and some of the expectations that come with that. And then the other thing is, communicate that they're going to be employed by that, so it's not a surprise in the process. And if you introduce it as a resource, then we can help the buyer sort of facilitate that and align with what they want the new culture to look like, and align with their existing culture for that organization. So great question, Chuck.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. Thanks for that. And to push on that a little bit more, I do know that there are some organizations that actually don't want to and shy away from using EOR as a solution, because they feel that it could actually impede the culture that's trying to be established, and therefore dilute that culture and not have those employees feel that they're engaged in part of the broader organization. And actually, quite honestly, I think that that's a misperception, because Andrew, if you take the point that you were making, that the EOR model is the facilitator to provide for, these will be my words, not yours, you can tell me if I'm wrong, provide for the care and feeding of the employees to ensure that they have a place to call home, that they're receiving their pay, that they're receiving benefits, that there's convenience for the employer there, that you're taking care of the care and feeding of the employees' basic needs through the EOR, but they're still part of the broader corporate ecosystem through many of these elements that are on the pyramid here, because they're going to be facilitating and working to deliver the mission, vision, value of the organization, because they're going to be getting direction and participating with managers and leaders in other parts of the organization around the world. There'll be an integral member within the org design, and they'll be participating in many aspects of that cultural attributes of the broader global enterprise that will make them feel part of it. And the EOR then is just a facilitator.
Yeah, it's the
people
vehicle.
at home.
Yeah, it's
exactly
the vehicle to employ and help facilitate, the culture of the new organization. But that is really driven from our clients and not from us. We're there to be that, to ensure compliance, to ensure that there is that local resource and touch, and as you said, to sort of pay, care, and feed the workers in a way. But we're not there to implement the corporate culture of the acquirer or the new co, depending on the type of M&A deal. So it's a vehicle and can be seen as that, and certainly can play a role in augmenting and supporting the corporate culture.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think too, this is just another of the, just like we had PEO and EOR as myth busting, I think this is also part of the myth busting too, that if the employees are part of EOR, that they're disassociated from the broader culture in the organization. In fact, one other point, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, even though I'm an EOR employee through Go Global, that I'm still accessing the corporate technology and email and other aspects of the company itself. And I'm really looked as an integral part of that company. And almost no one would know that EOR is the place where I'm getting my paycheck from.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We're the means to facilitate that. The worker is going to be on, typically on the client's email system, using the client's technology, working with the client's customers, developing oftentimes the client's technology. They're really an integrated part of the client's workforce. And again, we're the vehicle to support that. And again, if that's introduced as a resource and sort of a perk for the worker in any scenario where EOR is used, it usually just makes it really clear and transparent, and that sort of transition much easier. So I popped up. I'm conscious of time, so Bonnie, thank you for keeping us on track. So I wanted to pop this question up now. For a number of you, you've gone through some recent activity, so I would expect that this is going to be really relevant in terms of some of the challenges that you may have faced. I'm sure for those that haven't been through a recent deal, you may have been a part of deals past. So love to hear kind of what is the main challenge or bigger challenges that you're facing. Talent retention. I figured this would be key, which is one of the reasons why we're here talking about this today and looking at ways that that's less of an issue and how we can help with that going forward.
Yeah, what's interesting about that answer is that when in a lot of cases when people think about talent retention, a lot of times they'll just go, what's the amount of money we have to pay people to retain them? And what I'd like to do is reorient that thinking for people that in fact money is the last thing to think about, or what I'll call the gap filler in the context of the broader retention strategy. And this goes back to our earlier discussion about culture, engagement, alignment, belonging in an organization. Is let's get the other things right first, meaning answer people's questions about what's the mission, vision, value of the organization so people can feel like they want to be there or not. Do I have a job? And what's my career? Is it going to continue to be able to be facilitated when I move forward? How do my pay and benefits change? Is my boss going to change? And if so, is there alignment there between me and my boss? Those kind of things are in fact much more critical to the retention equation than eventually the money. The money will help stabilize things while any lack of clarity is worked out. But I would encourage people to really think through the qualitative aspects of the individual and their role in the organization in order to help stabilize and engage them, and then figure out what economic opportunity may be needed to help stabilize that as those things get worked out.
And if you think about that, I mean, just the implications are, the talent they are acquiring, whether it be tech talent and development talent in an acqui-hire scenario, or salespeople that or sort of customer support that know the client base of the organization or assets that you're buying really well. The risk to losing sales and the value of the deal by losing those sort of key personnel, and the role of communication and having that clear. I know in any sort of organizational setting, if there's a lack of clarity around what's going to happen next, where are we in terms of this process, you lose talent, and particularly in an M&A case, it's heightened even more. I thought we'd just spend a few minutes talking about the role of EOR. We've touched upon this on a couple of previous slides and during our discussion. So I won't read you the slides, but I think there's a few instances, right? So the first one is a carve out or an asset-based deal where the buyer doesn't have the infrastructure to employ the workers in that jurisdiction. So they're often referred to as orphaned employees without a home, right? So an EOR, again, can be a longer term solution. So if it's a small headcount, it probably would make financial sense. operate under an employer of record rather than setting up an entity. There's other considerations like business needs. It is hard in most circumstances. If you're employing somebody through an employer of record, they're probably not going to have signatory power. There are some industries and licenses that may be required to employ people, doctors, for example, that employer of record service provider likely doesn't have. So there are some roles that aren't, eligible for the employer of record. Typically, it could be an interim solution, and under our model and sort of the industry model, it's how do we get somebody on board quickly, and we can do it in 24 hours. Now, in an M&A case, probably less likely that it's going to be that short of a turnaround, but a lot of times, things are moving at deal speed. So I think it's critical that if you are working with an employer of record provider, that you have an idea of what the onboarding process timeline looks like. What are the things that they need to know in terms to facilitate that? And one of the big things is do they have an understanding of the compensation benefits in that country? Do they have things that sort of match or mirror that? If not, how do we work around that? And again, that's something that we're well versed in doing. We can help, manage the transition process. So that's a key element. We talked about communication. Having the ability to speak the language of the workers involved in the transaction, to understand the nuances and regulations in that country, but also just the cultural expectations. I think that's critical. If you can find a provider that has that level of expertise, sort of boots on the ground perspective. And then really the role is to manage the compliance aspect, the payroll aspect for those workers going forward. Again, could be a bridge solution, could be a long-term solution. I think there's a couple of other things. So, we're talking specifically about cross-border deals. I'd just like to mention a few other things that could come into play, both on the buy side and on the sell side perspective. What we're seeing a lot more now is attention to the type of workforce that an organization might have. And so one of the things that is very common now as companies grow is to hire independent contractors. It makes a lot of sense economically, but there are some potential red flags that come with that, particularly as you get to things like funding rounds, sales, IPOs. If in fact those workers are misclassified, it could cause a challenge in terms of the deal. The seller may identify that as a red flag. There may be things like Social Security payments and things like that they may deem as being necessary. So an employer of record can potentially help with that, right? One, like a Go Global, we can help identify if there are misclassified workers, if they should be employed. They may be eligible to be employed through the employer of record solution. So from a sell side perspective, it's something that you can clean up before a transaction. And from a buy side perspective, if you're looking at it, both in terms of the diligence, in terms of looking at that workforce and determining whether there's any potential liabilities around that. And then, again, in the purchase scenario, actually helping to employ those workers compliantly in the countries where that's applicable.
Yeah, there's actually one more I'd add to the list, Andrew, and it's actually characteristically when you and I first met each other, and I started working with Go Global, and that was along the line. It was a cross-border transaction, and there was no legal entity, and this was in Japan, and the selling company did want to divest this small piece of business and made sure it was part of the deal. The buyer wasn't clear that they wanted or needed a presence in Japan long term, but as part of the deal, they agreed to take it from the seller in order to determine what that disposition would be over time. And so this also allowed for a buyer to be able to acquire and facilitate the broader transaction and be able to assess what its ongoing longer term strategy is going to be and provide that flexibility to navigate in or out of that country And that's one of the beauties of the EOR solution, is it does provide flexibility to be either short or long term, depending on what that in-country strategy is going to be over the short or long term.
Yeah, and that was a perfect case. I mean, they weren't sure whether they wanted to maintain, the presence in that market, or even the workers. We were able to put term contracts into place. They ended up, staying on board and continuing the course there. But it gave them some options. So, employer of record can help a deal, potentially be transformational. I'll give another example. So, in an acquisition where you may have, or a merger of two equals, you may have overlapping assets. Maybe you have, finance in Singapore and in Hong Kong that's overlapping. Maybe you don't need to maintain both sets of workers. So, potentially you could, wind down legal entities, the cost that goes with maintaining those. But maybe there's one or two critical people that you want to maintain, and EOR could be a means to facilitate that. So it's a way to potentially take costs out of a deal, and still keep key workers involved in those assets. I am conscious of time, so I'm not going to go through every process that we go through in terms of our carve-out transition process. But I think the key thing is we do an analysis. We identify the gaps in terms of compensation and benefits, and then we make recommendations as to how to augment those gaps if they do exist. And then work with the buyer in terms of the implementation process, the communication process. Oftentimes we'll get involved in speaking at town halls, or even for smaller populations, one-on-ones with the workers, so they can understand what an employer of record does, where we fit, how it's going to work. Again, sort of presenting and making that process easier for both the worker and the parties involved. International deals. We have this chart here to talk a little bit about sort of the deal flow. Chuck, I'll maybe turn this over to you if you want to touch upon any of these parts that may be more applicable to international deals.
Yeah, well, at a macro level, if we think about what's happening on the deal flow process, this can be applied to any type of deal: small, large, single country, multi-country. Deals typically follow the same process, three general stage process of, do I want to do a deal? Yes, no. And what's the thesis? At stage 0. Stage 1 and 2 is around the diligence. Stage 3 and 4 is around integration planning and management. And so where the international / cross-border / global considerations take shape is just really thinking about the notion that when you get into HR issues in transactions, it's really critical to do this at a country by country level, because we're dealing with, as we talked about before, local labor regulations. There might be works councils, there could be unions, there could be the local labor laws governing when people can transition from buyer to seller, notification periods. So it's important to understand that through the diligence process and get that down at a country level. And then at the integration planning process, understanding how long it's going to take to facilitate that integration and that transition and integration into the buyer and seller programs. So same general pace, strategy, structure of the deal. The devil's in the details, and really putting that down at the country level and being very granular about that. So there's a couple points from that perspective, Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. In the conscious of time, I'm just going to skip ahead to kind of some final thoughts here, and then I know there's a couple of questions, and we're running towards the end here, but I think a few things that we hoped you'd learn is just a strong and agile project management team is key. Identify project resources earlier, identify the leadership that's going to be involved in the transaction. Chuck, I'll maybe let you go through some of these as well. But I want to spend a couple of minutes. There's a couple of good questions here, and I know we need to hand back over to HR.com here at the end. So is there any other, key points that you want to speak to before we answer some questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll link one key theme that's smack dab in the middle of the page here and links into our whole discussion about EOR, which is very distinct focus on day one and day one requirements. And so if we think about the discussion on in carve outs, and if these are asset deals and we're not getting legal entities, that really look at all of the tools and strategies available for ensuring day one readiness and requirements. And the EOR solution can really be a strong tool in the toolbox to facilitate speed to day one and facilitating day one stabilization for the deal itself and for the workers that are involved. So I would focus on that one as an additional lesson, is be very critically focused on day one.
Communication and culture are I think two big themes that I would pull away from today. I agree. I think one of the things that we often run into in terms of deals, and I think this is also where EOR can help, right, is sometimes companies haven't made allowances for the time and really thought about what the day one requirements are. And so maybe the TSAs aren't structured to accommodate that. So EOR can be a solution in those scenarios. It's going to be a nimble and quick scenario to employ workers, particularly in carve out deals. So appreciate that. A couple of questions. So Helen's question around, would you consider EOR very relevant in an economy that has high rate of unemployment? If yes, why? I don't know how to answer that question specifically around unemployment, but typically when you have unemployment in a country, it means that there may be some instability in the economy and in the structure there. And a lot of times, especially if you're looking at a small headcount, it comes with a lot of time and effort to set up in a country like that. Oftentimes those countries are often the most heavily regulated and take the most time to set up in, but it also may be something that you may not, at least in the interim or the near term, want a permanent establishment in. And so an employer of record gives you the ability to sort of be in that market, hire talent in that market without the cost time requirement to set up in that country. And so from that perspective, I think it is a really relevant solution. In terms of, why there's unemployment, and the type of talent that you're hiring, I would look at that really closely. There may be some opportunities to hire in a market like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have nothing to add, Andrew, on that one. Thanks.
There was another question here. Maybe that is the HR leader the last one to go?
I wasn't sure what that meant. So yes, that the person turning the lights off at the end.
I think it really depends on the organization, Chuck. I mean, you've obviously been the CHRO or interim CHRO. So in carve-out deals, maybe there isn't that sort of leader that comes with the deal. Oftentimes, the HR leaders are really important to the success of the deal because they know the employee population. They know where the importance, where the talent is, where the high flyers are within the organization. So I could see if you were sort of looking at, leadership positions, that it'd be a critical part of the deal. And if you weren't going to keep leadership, they may be the last one to go.
Yeah, I'd actually flip it around and say the HR leader should actually be the first one to come. Because to your point, if you're facilitating a carve out and part of the carve out is operationalizing the business and making sure it's stood up and capable across, you need a really strong HR leader to actually help get that stood up and get the right people, processes, systems in place and understand the criticality of that. So can't underscore that as a critical role very early on in these kind of transactions.
So I'd like to hand it back to the team at HR.com. And again, I appreciate everybody's time and questions today. There was a good level of interaction, so I appreciate it. Thank you, Chuck.
Likewise. Thank you, Andrew. It was awesome. I appreciate doing this with you. It was fun.
Good jam session.
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on the HR.com website within 24 hours. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.